Welcome to the April 4th, 2019 program of the Tucson Cactus and Succulent Society. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Robert H. Webb, retired hydrologist. But we know him better as Bob, the co-owner with his wife of Arid Land Greenhouses, a world traveler to great succulent locations, and one of the foremost authorities on Sansevierias. The International Sansevierias Society is now housed in Tucson, and Bob and Alan Mickelburst, who's sitting up front here, are chairman and editors. I know you'll be excited as I am about Sansevierias, so welcome, Bob.
Well, alrighty then. You have my.
I don't have it, but just look a few points.
Okay, I could be talking about this. It's the largest adenium I've ever seen in Africa. That could easily fit in the bed of a pickup truck all by itself. But no, we're not going to talk about that. We'll be talking about this. The adenias are really, really cool, and there's a lot of them in East Africa. They're really, really nice caduciform species, and tree euphorbias everywhere. They're really, really fine. I grow a lot of them at my nursery. Or these aloes. Aloes are probably the reason I went to Africa in the first place. But no, we're going to talk about mother-in-law time. Why in the world would I want to do that? Well, let's ask this guy. I don't know if anybody else has noticed, but the giraffes in Africa are getting to be real smart alecks. And I think it's because of the Italian tourists. Just saying. The International Sansevierias Society has been around for a little while. We can really trace back the origins of this to this guy by the name of Horst Pfennig, who was a German, started off in the 1980s doing a lot of very interesting work to repopularize the genus Sansevieria. Pfennig unfortunately died rather prematurely and kind of left things hanging, which was really unfortunate for him and everybody else. Juan Chahinian came along in the late 1980s into the 1990s, had a journal called the Sansevieria Journal, and published a book called The Splendid Sansevieria, which I still recommend to people if they can find it. Dick told me that he just bought one on the used book market, for example. It's a flawed book, but it's the best that we've got available. But then Alan Butler came along and started a whole new journal and a society called the International Sansevierias Society. And he started the journal Sansevieria, and we're now at issue 39. A few years ago, the International Sansevierias Society moved to Tucson when Butler ceded to Alan Michelbust and myself. We have a bit of an identity crisis. We can't tell who's the journal editor and who's the chairman. And I don't think it really even matters to us at all. We both just do whatever job's available for us. But then we got this guy who hangs around, Lynn Newton, who's a very, very good friend of mine and a good traveling companion to my wife Tony and I. He's our science editor and he's the world's foremost authorities on Sansevierias. And these are the most recent two-issue covers. We pride ourselves on having a high-quality publication, and if you're familiar with the Audubon Society's Vermilion Flycatcher, our publication has the same layout person, and we use the same press as the Vermilion Flycatcher, so it's for high quality, and if you would like to see some examples, Alan and I both have copies here tonight, as well as membership forms if you'd like to join our society. Now, here's the lineup of people, and we really are an international society. Alan and I, of course, are up at the top. Juan Chahinian's in Florida. He's the honorary president. Lynn Newton in the UK is our science editor. Membership secretary is Chris Ayers from the UK, and Al Elias, who's actually in Wales, is our back issues kind of a guy. And tonight is Dick Wiedoff's last night with the Tucson Cactus and Succulent Society, because now he's joining us full time as our director of communications. I'm just saying, you know, just say goodbye to Dick tonight because he's ours. Okay, so one of the things that Alan and I have done, we have a big commitment to this. Alan, for much longer than I have, he's been doing Sansevierias for more than 40 years. My story is that on my first trip to Africa in 2003, I thought I was going to go look at aloes, and sure enough, I looked at a lot of aloes, but I brought home a suitcase load of Sansevierias with permits and phytosanitary certificates. And that's the start of my part of the living collection that we've got. Lynn Newton has really rammed home the concept of living collections, because if you've ever been in an herbaria, and I have many times, and looked at squash dead plants, you're in this really kind of nasty, dusty place, and it's really hard to tell what those things look like in real life. So we have them living in our 2 different nurseries in Tucson now, and we're using it for DNA work, among other things, as well as describing new species. And most of my talk tonight is going to be to show you some of the new species that are now coming out on Sansevierias. We've had a big burst in terms of looking at the taxonomy of this genus. So one of the things that really starting to get to be an issue with us is the whole issue of the genus Dracaena versus the genus Sansevieria and what family they're housed under. Now, in the past, the whole Sansevieria group, if you want to call it that, has been in the Agaveaceae, the Dracaenaceae, the Asparagaceae, the Nolanaceae, and the Ruscaceaceae. Okay? Well, okay, let's just cut to the chase. We'll take that one of this group, okay? But then there's another one here, which is this the same genus? Are these 2 things the same genus or not? And if they are, the genus Dracaena has precedence over it. So this would be, instead of Sansevieria pearsoni, this would be Dracaena pearsoni. Well, maybe not so fast. We'll take this one. Now, if you think that this is some kind of, trivial thing, keep in mind that my email conversation in the last 2 days has been with a woman who teaches the horticulture classes at the National Botanical Garden in Washington, D.C., asking this very same question. What does she do in her classes? And my reaction is, well, I still use Sansevieria and Dracaena separately. And I will until we get some more information that indicates otherwise, or we accept that the way it is. So let's go through this for a second. That's a Dracaena. That's not not a Sansevieria. That's a Dendrocycleos. That's an Adenium sulcatrona. Back to the Adenium thing. It's not a Sansevieria, and that's not a Sansevieria either right there. Although we're going to get back to that subject in just a little bit about that whole issue of the relationship between humans and Sansevierias. So here's the organization. For those of you who are unfamiliar with how scientifically we organize plant taxonomy, it kind of works this way if you kind of leave the family and higher parts of the kingdom out. We have a genus, and then we have species, but in between you have subgenus, section, and series. Those 3 little subcategories, if you will, are very useful for organizational purposes, for heuristic purposes, if you will, to kind of segregate things together. And then below that, you've got subspecies and varieties. So what happened was Horst Finnig, who's the first one to start getting interested in this, said, we really need 3 subgenera. We need the subgenera Sansevieria, the subgenus Capitatus, and the subgenus Paniculatus. And that refers to a few things that I'll get to in just a second. A guy by the name of Jankowski came along, and I think he was anticipating that Sansevierias would all become Dracaenas, and therefore he would need to be in the section category. He renamed those for some reason that we don't use. Here's what we're now using at the present time, pending a whole bunch of different taxonomic issues to be resolved. The subgenus Sansevieria has got 61 species in it. What it amounts to is it's got an unbranched inflorescence. So you see a little, what Lynn Newton doesn't like me to say, but I'll say it anyway, a spike, an inflorescence spike coming up off of the plant, usually from the apical meristem. It can be either the apical meristem actually can be subterranean on these because Sansevierias are all about the roots. That's a very, very important point that we'll get back to several times here. Subgenus Capitatus has a capitate or a head-like inflorescence. They're very interesting plants, and usually the inflorescence comes straight out of the ground. And then subgenus Paniculatus are what you might consider to be the tree Sansevierias. They're the taller things, and some of those are up here. And the inflorescence is produced from the meristem, but it's multi-branched. So it's a very interesting inflorescence set. We're going to go through a few of these with some examples of some new species. So first off, this is a map that I made a while back that shows the countries of where Sansevierias are located. And you can see that West Africa's got a few, just a few. And then there's some over in Burma and the Indian subcontinent. South Africa's got quite a few, but okay, there's 85 of them, but the biodiversity hotspot's East Africa. And that's one of the reasons why I'll be showing you a lot of things from East Africa. That's where most of the new species are coming from, is that part of the world. That's both the Lynn Newton influence as well as the fact that there's just a lot of them there, and we keep finding more and more of them as with each additional trip. So as this guy would remind me, this hyena, is let's get back to the mother-in-law tongue for just a second, because that is often considered to be a trash plant by people, but it actually is beginning to become one of the more interesting species in terms of research and understanding the distribution of Sansevierias in Africa. This is mother-in-law tongue right here, Sansevieria trifasciata. But this one is one that we're going to name in a future issue of Sansevieria, subspecies Sakawe. The interesting thing about this is the inflorescence is zigzagged. I had never seen that on a Sansevieria before. This is a plant that we think that Washingtonian called in his many notes slimmeret. And it has a number of different widths on the leaves here. Some of the leaves are just maybe an inch wide, and some of them are 2 to 3 inches wide. And a fellow that I work with, Barry Yinger, out of, he's now in Thailand, but he spends a lot of time in Tanzania, is hunting this thing down and is realizing it's in places where it could not have possibly become naturalized. It had to be native there a long time ago and evolved in place. So, since the original mother-in-law tongue is from the Congo and the main plant is from Nigeria, and here's slimmeret down here in Tanzania, looks like it's native. There's another one up in Uganda that looks like it's native there. So what's in between? Well, a bunch of countries with civil wars and Ebola virus. So I don't think I'm going there anytime soon. But, you know, there's other people that are working in those areas. For instance, I've been talking to somebody in Cameroon, for example, who's been working on the whole Dracaenaceae of Cameroon. So that brings up a very big issue, because in an ideal world, I'd be able to go to Somalia, which is probably the biodiversity hotspot in reality of these species, but I'm not going there anytime soon because of a little group called Al-Shabaab, which would take my head off. Okay? The geopolitical realities of the situation really tend to trump the scientific goals that we've got. So just so that you know that, we rely a lot on previous people's collections, and I'll show you that in spades here in just a second. One of the things that has been Lynn Newton's big influence has been to say we need to go back and find the type localities of all these species and go back and find out what the thing actually looks like as opposed to what's grown in cultivation. Sansevieria dawii, for example, is something that's commonly grown in cultivation, and yet when we found it at the type locality, it does not look like the highly variegated thing that we see in cultivation here in the US. It's more of a plain Jane kind of a species with a very interesting inflorescence. So we're trying to learn about what these things really look like in the wild. This one, for example, was a revision that I did. There's a species out there that was known as Sansevieria nilotica obscura, and we went to the type locality near Kampala, Uganda, and it looks just like the regular species. So why keep this as a subspecies? It doesn't make any sense at all. The reason it was labeled as a subspecies is one guy collected nilotica many, many hundred years ago up in the north of Uganda. Another guy came down and found this thing, and they left them separate for all this time. So trying to make the revision and trying to figure out what's what here is really important by going to the typicality. But then there's the issue of what these things look like in the wild. Because we're so used to seeing a plant and saying, oh, I know what that mammillaria is, for example, or I know what that phaerocactus is. Do you really? Because if you start looking at them in the wild, you come up with this kind of thing. This is Sansevieria fisheri, and those two are Sansevieria fischeri, and that's Sansevieria fischeri. Okay? This one in the center is 6 feet tall. This one over here is about 1 foot tall. Okay? And we have to start asking this question, do we lump things together as a result of natural variability, or do we start really being a splitter? I tend to be more on the lumping side. This is one where I've taken a stand on it. A fellow by the name of Paul Mbugua, who I've met, he was a PhD student of Lynn Newton's, described a thing for Horst Finnig. He named it a Sansevieria finnigi, which was really unfortunate because it's pretty obvious that this is actually Sansevieria canaliculata. Mbugua never went to the locality of this. He just looked at an herbarium specimen. So we have this, and then you've got these two things, and theoretically, they're all the same. How much variability can one tolerate and still have something as a species? Or do you have to resort to subspecies and varieties to clarify the issue? These are big questions that everybody who's in the plant taxonomy game has to play those games. So this is Sansevieria hyacinthoides in South Africa. This is down near Port Elizabeth, and big stand of this stuff. The genus Sansevieria owes itself to this species. Linnaeus, of all people, was the one that named the genus, and this was his type species right here. And there it is. But the problem is that, again, that variability issue, this thing over here on the right was mapped by the South Africans as Sansevieria hyacinthoides, and the one over on the left, that is Sansevieria hyacinthoides. Could they be the same? Not really. This one over here looks a lot like the East African stuff that I'll show you in just a moment. It doesn't look anything like that, which has got flexible leaves, flexible smooth leaves. This one's got very rigid rough leaves on it. Again, trying to work things out by going into the field is really, really important. This is another example of it, Sansevieria aethiopica. It's not from Ethiopia. Again, a lot of the Sansevierias, as well as aloes, are named for places where they don't occur. That's because a lot of the specimens were mixed up in shipments back in the 19th century. And they were named for places where they don't even occur. But Aethiopica is from Namibia and South Africa. This is what it typically looks like on the left. This form over here was 1 kilometer away, okay, in Namibia. And this one is one that I'm very interested in, and I hope to eventually name it for a friend of mine that many of you might know. He was in Tucson for a while, Gerard Marx, who's now back in South Africa and is a preeminent Haworthia hybridizer. I want to name it Aethiopica subspecies marxii because it's growing all by itself in a place in the southern part of the Eastern Cape province of South Africa. Now, I think the Italians have been getting to the leopards too. So I'm just saying that this guy is trying to remind me to pick this up and look at a few other little issues. This genus is really remarkably diverse. If you've never looked at it, you might want to look at the stuff along the front counter here, along the stage, because we've got a really wide variety of different species here. But this group right here has fascinated me, what we call the Safruticosa group. It's a bunch of spiky leaf things. They're basically cylindrical, pointy leaves, very, very nasty to be around because they're very sharp. This is the smallest one of them, Sansevieria ballii. Lynn Newton named this one. This is one that's actually up here on the stage, one of the rarest Sansevierias. This is Sansevieria ilensis from a little place called Isle Somalia, and I'll get to Isle in just a second. This is Bella, another Lynn Newton species. Again, a nice little spiky cylindrical thing. And there it is, very pretty. That's why he named it Bella, because of the nice variegation along the stems. And this is my first Sansevieria that I described with Lynn Newton, Laevifolia, named because of the smooth leaves that it's got compared to the other ones, which are rough. There it is in flower at my greenhouse. And there it is with a little girl that I paid a couple of shillings to hold that thing. And you can see just how big it is. It's the largest leaves of the Saffruticosa group. So kind of to illustrate this, from largest to smallest leaves, this is that group. With Ilensis down in the bottom center being the smallest, and Laevifolia, the one I described, being the largest. There's a lot of variability here, but the other thing is there's a lot of geography here too. This stuff goes from Tanzania up into Ethiopia and Somalia as well. So it's a very interesting set of stuff. When I first went to Africa with Lynn Newton in 2003, he was just, oh, everything's Sansevieria rafilii if it's a broadleaf species. It's all Sansevieria rafilii, right? Well, maybe. And then he started to realize, not so fast. We can break some of this stuff out. And that's what Lynn and I have primarily been working on, are these broadleaf species like rafilii. Here's one that's highly variegated, for example. There's a whole lot of variability in them. This is conspicua. I believe this was another one of, no, this is a brown species right here, but notice it doesn't have any variegation in it whatsoever. It tends to also be in complete shade. This is Forskliana from Yemen. This is the photograph I took in Yemen. And this species has been kind of, because people were sort of lazy, they decided to transpose this species on East Africa. Not so fast. That doesn't work for me. So we're trying to unravel this whole deal. And here's some of the stuff that we're looking at. This is elliptica, which is an old species name. It's one that has roughened leaves on both sides. And there's one in cultivation called Horwood, what's it, 452, I think, that's out there for sale all over the place. This is probably the root of all of it. And it's all through East Africa, particularly the eastern part of Kenya. This is a really cool little species from Isle Somalia. Now, if you've never heard of Isle, then I will let you go right back in time to about 5 to 10 years ago when there were these pirates from Somalia that were going out there and capturing oil tankers and holding them for ransom. Their base was Isle Somalia. So I don't think I'm going there anytime soon either. But fortunately, somebody else did. So we have Sansevieria ilensis from Isle Somalia. And now, Alan Michaelbust and I described Sansevieria chaheniani, which is this broadleaf species right here, and we named it for Juan Chahenian, because Juan has contributed so much to the hobby that we like. This one is Sansevieria specksii. Ernst Specks, who used to run a nursery in Germany called Exotica, was the guy that found this. It's over in Benin, so it's the third species now from West Africa. Alan and I described this one and named it for Ernst. So it has a very interesting flower. One of the things that I was really, really stupid about early on was to make the statement that all Sansevieria flowers look the same. Oh, no, they don't. This one, the tepals shred all the way down the tube. So the tepals actually are about 2 inches long, and it looks like a shaggy brush on the inflorescence. It's really very interesting. So one of the things that really interested me a great deal was the whole thing called the Sansevieria ehrenbergii concept. And I think there's an ehrenbergii up here. I'm not sure. But it occurs in all these different places, or at least it's thought to occur, all the way from southern Tanzania, near Lindi, all the way over into Oman, and then up in Eritrea. So a very broad distribution that people were tagging this whole thing with Sansevieria ehrenbergii. Not so fast. So first off, Tom McCoy and John Lavranos decided, and rightly so, to call the one in Oman Sansevieria dophorica. This is my lovely wife standing next to a patch in 1999 in Oman, and she was hyperventilating at that time because it was one of the first succulent plants we ever saw in the wild in the Arabian Peninsula in Africa. It was just a really, really cool place to see all these Sansevieria ehrenbergii. Old photo, that's why it looks kind of weird. But there it is, growing in Tucson. We took, Tony and I took 2 trips to Yemen and spent a total of 6 weeks there. And this is one of those fabled cities in Yemen. And they're real. They're very interesting places. And in this particular place, you see the real Sansevieria ehrenbergii. And this is another one that's sort of breathtaking to me anyway, looking at all these guys, particularly things like this. These plants are only about 12 inches to 18 inches tall total. That's how big they are, and they tend to be just sort of rising, but they don't really recurve so much in terms of the leaves. This is Sansevieria robusta. It forms these huge stands, especially in the Rift Valley of Kenya and Tanzania. Just big impenetrable stands that it grows in. This is part of that complex. This is one that everybody had just totally punted, but we got down to the type locality for it, Sansevieria perotea, and that's the Indian Ocean right there behind. Okay, that's growing right on the coast. And see how recurved the leaves are. People were calling this ehrenbergii as well. Not ehrenbergii, this is perotea. And this guy we'll get to in a minute. This is Wire Batala, a good friend of mine from Tanzania who I've traveled with quite a few times now. So one of the things that Alan and I did, again with that living collection that the two of us maintain, Alan had this thing that was called ehrenbergii that flowered for us. And we decided, okay, it's time to do something about this. So we named it for John Lavranos, who, John Lavranos was a funny guy because reputedly he told people he hated Sansevierias. So why did he collect like 40 of them and put numbers on them? And his collection of Sansevierias is just a gold mine for us because it's out of Somalia. And that's the place we can't go anymore. So we have all this living collection where when they start to flower, we can fit them into the existing structure of Sansevierias. But Sansevieria lavrani is now out there with a name on it. Alan and I described that. And this is what it looks like in real life. This is Guilford Poas's, the late Guilford Poas's wife, Patricia, with Tony, standing on the Suyan Ranch, which is Guilford's ranch. Guilford, I wish I could have the same obituary as Guilford Poas, trampled by an elephant, which was really tragic, but somehow it just really worked for that man. I mean, he was a great guy. We spent a lot of time with him and unfortunately never got to travel with him. But he collected, he was a collector of plants in that region. And his garden is probably, I've argued this point with Lynn Newton, it's probably the best botanical garden in East Africa. A private garden where he's collected all this stuff, a lot of undescribed species. Okay, we're now into the subgenus Paniculatus. These are plants that have multi-branched inflorescences and tend to be tree-like. Arborescens, as the name indicates, is a large species, tends to grow up 6 to 9 feet tall. Here it is in cultivation. And Wire Batala, we'll get back to him many times here, Wire Batala collected this dwarf form that flowered for me in my living collection, and I'm going to name it subspecies Wire for Wire Batala. And that'll be in a future issue. So, as I said, Stupid Bob said all Sansevieria flowers were the same. Remember the one with the shredding tepals? Look at these. These are cylinders. These are like cleistocactus flowers. There's almost the tepals almost have no spread to them whatsoever. We got to the type locality of Sansevieria bagamoyoensis at Bagamoyo, Tanzania, and found it. This is another one that's been very misunderstood. So people wanted to throw it into other genera, into other species, but it's definitely something very different, and we have a lot of that now. Here is another one that Lynn Newton described, ascendens. And it's named ascendens because if you look at the inflorescence over on the left there, if you can see that inflorescence, it's doing this kind of a thing like a candelabra. And Lynn found that to be significantly different from all the other ones, which tended to bloom at right angle. The branches out are at right angle on them. So this is one from, again, Kenya, maybe into Somalia as well, in the coastal plain. And Dumitescens is probably the tallest of the Sansevierias. Lynn wrote an article about that, talking about the largest of the Sansevierias. All of this being, by the way, in the journal Sansevieria, that is our flagship publication of our organization. But Dumitescens is a really, really cool plant that has very flexible, very sharp leaves as well. Kitty, kitty. And this is the mate. The Serengeti is a very interesting place. I don't believe in bucket lists because I like to go places before I, would think about a bucket list. But if you haven't been to the Serengeti, trust me, it's worth it. It's an amazing place. But this is an amazing man. This is Wiri Batala. Wiri is actually trained as a lawyer at Dar es Salaam University. He's from Mwanza in Tanzania. His tribal group is one of the smallest in Tanzania, and he was native to a little island in Lake Victoria. But Wiri took it upon himself one day that he liked to go hunt Sansevierias, and that's what he's done, is hunt Sansevierias. And this is one of the ones that he found. And this was a major missing link, if you would, in the Sansevieria community. What I called Sansevieria Batala when Lynn Newton and I described it. This is Wiri at his nursery in Arusha, Tanzania, holding a flowering specimen of Sansevieria Batale. Now, if you think this is a little bit unusual and this doesn't really ring a bell with you, you might start taking a look at the nature of these leaves and think about that. Superclone is a Sansevieria that Grigsby's Botanical Garden has been distributing for at least 30 years. That's now part of the genus, of the species Sansevieria batale. It's become a fairly widespread thing. We were surprised. A fellow by the name of Joaquin Tita from Germany came back to me after we published this and said, hey, I've seen that same thing in Malawi. So now we've got it in a very, very broad area to the west of the Rift Valley and to around the Serengeti plains of Tanzania, all the way to the south, maybe even into Zimbabwe for all we know. Now, one of the things about Sansevierias that you need to know if you want to grow these things is that they have two forms, at least two forms. They have a juvenile form and they have an adult form. This is the juvenile form of Batale, and some of the more interesting collectibles that people have been selling, like silver blue, other ones like that, are actually juvenile forms of Sansevieria batale. So one of the problems with cultivating Sansevierias is you don't just plant seeds, because if you collect seeds off of these things and plant them, you're going to get the juvenile form, and it may persist for 10 to 15 years. Maybe that's what you want. I planted seeds from Dave Richards of Zimbabwe, who's now another guy that's died, of Sansevieria hallei, and they still are juvenile form 12 years later. Okay, they don't form the nice hallei that I think we've got up here in the front. So most Sansevierias are propagated by cuttings. That's how we do it, is by division of plants and by cuttings. And that's the reason right there. So this place right here, to me, will always be fondly known as either the water closet stop, the loo stop, or the pee break. So we decided before we got to the border between Kenya and Tanzania, we're in Tanzania here, that we needed to stop and relieve ourselves. So I walk over to a bush, look down, and I saw that stuff. Okay, and it turns out that stuff is a new species. Now, we're having a rather remarkable winter. Don't you agree? Into spring, it was a very, very interesting year. Well, two undescribed species of Sansevierias that I've been waiting 10 years to have flower, they flowered this winter. And this is now Sansevieria enchiridifolia. Okay? Enchiridifolia, here it is growing in my greenhouse here in Tucson. Again, a living collection. Enchiridifolia means dagger-like leaves. The leaves on this thing are very rigid, and they look like, I wanted to have it as a sword, but that name has already been taken. So it's a dagger-like leaf thing, and it's just a beautiful flower on it. Notice how the flowers curl up, the tepals. It's very interesting how these are different. This is one that Guilford Poas turned us on to this. He said, Bob, you got to go up to the Marsabit in Kenya. So we drove up north, convinced Lynn to do that. We drove up through the mud, got up to north, and found it. This is Patricia Poas in the garden at Suyan Ranch, and there it is over in the wild. And it's a very interesting species because it seems like it bridges something that John Livranos collected over in Somalia. Again, I can't say enough about John Livranos and his collections because in terms of biogeography and understanding things, he was brilliant. And it's unfortunate that he's dead now too. But this particular species is a new one that is in my greenhouse just waiting to bloom. Um, Another one that Wiri Batala found that just bloomed this year, and I've been waiting for it for 10 years, is rugosafolia. It's named rugosafolia because it's rough. The leaves are rough on both sides. So it's a very interesting species for that reason. And here it is flowering in Wiri Batala's nursery in Arusha, Tanzania. And there it is flowering in my nursery in Tucson. And it's a very interesting flower that since it's really closely spaced with Enchiridifolia, it's interesting that the two of them are not very far apart geographically, but the inflorescence is very, very different on the two, as are the leaves. Lynn was obsessed with this one. He had it growing in his garden, a fellow by the name of, I think it's Antonio Foresti, an Italian guy in Nairobi, who had found this thing over in southwestern Kenya. Brought it in, Lynn planted it in his garden as he always did, waited, no flowers, waited, no flowers, waited, no flowers. Then he decided to move back to England, but he got a note from somebody that said, hey, I've seen something that looks like that Foresti thing out in southwestern Kenya. So we got in our vehicle and drove out there and found it. And there it is. And so Lynn was really happy that we're able to describe this one as Sansevieria foresti. It's interesting because it's smooth on one side, rough on the other, and the inflorescence is again very different. So to make this simple, we're trying to unravel this mess that was all these broadleaf things that Lynn originally called, oh, that's just all Sansevieria rafflei. Well, not anymore, it's not. We're slowly working our way through it. This one actually is one of Gilfred Poas's garden plants that now is flowered. It finally flowered after, I think, 25 years in his garden. And this one is a big story associated with this. I might as well just tell you about it. Gilfred and a friend of his decided to go up near the Ethiopian border of Kenya. And he wanted to do some exploring around Moaba Hill. So they landed a small plane, because Gilfred was a bush pilot. Gilfred landed his plane. They went walking around, found this thing, put it back into the plane, then took off again and were shot at and forced to land in Ethiopia and held captive for a month by the Ethiopian army for allegedly violating Ethiopian airspace. So he had his plane shot up, but he managed to get away with the plants. Guy had real commitment. But it's now flowering, and his daughter Anne is helping us with this now to get it described as Sansevieria malabensis. Just so that you know, there's already a Sansevieria povicii for Gilfred Poas. It's a plant that he found on an island off the coast of Kenya as well. I'm going to leave it at just one page for growing Sansevierias. I know that Vaughn asked me for more, but I want to make this brief. You should read Alan Michaelbus' article that he put into your newsletter quite a while back now about the ones that can take freezing. But Sansevierias are all about the roots. They're not about the above ground, they're about the roots. So stick them in the ground and they'll take off. I've had subspicata growing in my yard now for 25 years. So it can take the freezing. When you put them in pots, you use a typical cactus mix. They aren't treated any differently than any other succulents, but they like a lot of shade. It's maybe not obvious from the photos that I showed, but almost every one of these plants is in shade. There's very few of them that are growing out in full sun, in habitat. Some of them, yes. Most of them, no. So they like a lot of shade, and I grow mine in 100% shade at my nursery. And all about the roots, but we tend to water them a little less than most succulent plants. Alan, I think, treats his more or less like Mark was describing for adeniums. Okay? Don't water them at all or very sparsely in the winter and just gradually bring them out of dormancy in the spring like we're in right now. One of the remarkable things about Sansevierias is that they're almost pest-free. I've heard that they're susceptible to, some of the cultivars anyway, are susceptible to fungal attacks in Guatemala, Central America, and in Thailand. But here, I haven't seen anything that's really affected them in a big way. I use a lot of pesticides in my greenhouse. I have to, but almost none of them go on Sansevierias because they just don't need them. Okay, so I'd like to to end this talk with this place. You might have heard of Olduvai Gorge before. It's the cradle of humanity, right? The Leakeys went in there and they found all these hominids and came up with the whole evolution issue of humans. But the thing is, it's actually misnamed. It's not Olduvai Gorge. The Maasai, the tribe that's there, call it Oldpai Gorge. And Oldpai is Maasai for Sansevieria, particularly Sansevieria robusta. So I'm here to humbly suggest that we are all evolved from Sansevierias. Thank you very much.